The Westboro Baptist Church is not just a hate group. It's not just a bunch of stereotypical religious fanatics that everyone thinks they are. It's actually an incredibly complex and interesting culture, and today I made this simple vlog as a medium to attempt to explain their culture using the best way I know how, which in this case would be public speaking. So, before I begin my project, let's define what culture is based on my standards. So I'm going to say that culture is the shared values, characteristics, and beliefs of a specific group of individuals defined by anything from religion to cuisine to social habits to music. And I'll be looking at this culture, and I think that this would be considered a religious non-material culture. So I'll be specifically focusing on how this culture is diffused, and I'll be proving everything I just explained to you through a couple lenses. So first of all, I'll be talking about the origins of this culture. I'll be talking about the beliefs of this culture. I'll be talking about the sustainability. I'll be talking about the responses by other culture parties. And finally, I'm going to compare them to other movements. So start off with the origins. So the person that founded this, a man named Fred Phelps, was actually originally a civil rights activist and a lawyer. It's ironic considering the fact that what he believed in was getting rid of things like the Jim Crow laws, which would be considered laws that were incredibly discriminatory. But at the same time, with the Westboro Baptist Church, much of what they actually preach is intolerance against homosexuality. I'll be talking about that a little bit later. So this church was originally part of the East Side Baptist Church, this pretty large church within Kansas, and Fred Phelps was the pastor of the Westboro branch, but they soon broke off because of conflicting ideologies. So the first time that the Westboro Baptist Church truly came to become what it is right now was when it complained to the local government about having too much homosexual sex within the nearby park. And then they soon put up signs warning about homosexuals in 1991. Soon, it called other churches to protest these homosexual acts within the park, but all these different churches lashed out against the Westboro Baptist Church, which led them to actually hate on homosexuals on a regular basis. So let's talk about a little bit about all their beliefs, okay? So first of all, they consider themselves an old school Baptist church, which follows the 5 points of Calvinism. It considers almost every other religious organization akin to, and this is quotations from their website, devil worship, and labels many of these other churches as satanic frauds preaching Arminian lies. For its views on homosexualities, to paraphrase their website, they believe that almost every tragedy in the world is linked to homosexuality. They believe that God is punishing the world because of society's increasing tolerance and their acceptance of the homosexual agenda, and that homosexuality is the greatest sin of all. This is partly based on Leviticus 18:22 of the Bible, which states, "Thou shalt not lie with mankind as with womankind, it is abomination." Next, for their views on Catholicism, the Westboro Baptist Church describes the Roman Catholic Church as the largest, most well-funded, and organized pedophile group in the history of man. For its views on Judaism, the Westboro Baptist Church claims that Jews killed Jesus and that God brought the Holocaust to punish them. For its views on Islam, it believes that Muhammad was a demon-possessed whoremonger and pedophile who contrived a 300-page work of satanic fiction. And then, quite strangely, one of the things that they proclaim the most is their views on celebrities, public figures, and politicians. So they believe that anyone that doesn't use their public platform to praise God is sinning. They also have many specific reasons why they hate specific celebrities. In this case, one of the people that they protested against was Nelson Mandela because of assumptions that he committed adultery. And surprisingly, their views on racism, they actually condemn apartheid laws and are vehemently opposed to racism as a whole because of the fact that Fred Phelps was actually a civil rights activist beforehand and actually protested against the Jim Crow laws. Now, the interesting thing is that they believe that racism should not exist within the world because that was not actually part of the Bible. And finally, and this is one of the most controversial aspects of their group, one of the things that's creating quite a lot of negative criticism is their views on victims of wars and on disasters. So they believe that God created all these disasters to punish soldiers. This included signs such as God created the IEDs, God started 9/11, and included them protesting things like the Sichuan earthquakes, the Sandy Hook Elementary shootings, and more. So next, let's talk a little bit about sustainability, and this is where a lot of the cultural aspects can actually be seen. So they have quite a bit of contagious diffusion within this group. Why is that? Mostly because of the fact that the Westboro Baptist Church is largely made up of their family members. So what they have is a very close-knit and exclusive community. In this case, the Westboro Baptist Church is made up of its leader, Pastor Fred Phelps, who we've already talked about, and 9 of his 13 children. The other 4 are estranged. And then this includes their children and their spouses and a small number of other families and individuals. That would be the contagious diffusion part of it, because this is such an exclusive group and because family ties usually has quite a lot of contagious diffusion. So they host weekly meetings inside of their hearth, which is in Topeka, Kansas, of the United States. And one of the ways that they actually get to so many people is from hierarchical diffusion. How is that? Well, they actually hold something called the picketing ministry, in which they hold numerous protests each day. They hold protests at funerals, religious institutions, and schools. And legally, they manage to sustain themselves under the First Amendment grounds. So when the Snyder family tried to sue them for defamation in 2006 for protesting at their son's funeral, the Supreme Court actually ruled in favor of the Westboro Baptist Church because of their freedom to religion. Next, let's talk a little bit more about this hierarchical diffusion concept. So they actually first came into the national spotlight when CNN featured them in a story about their picketing of a young man's funeral. They would often picket the funerals of famous celebrities, which gave them quite a lot of publicity. For example, they picketed the funeral of Michael Jackson. And they were also the subject of many films and TV shows, for example, the documentary The Most Hated Family in America, which is primarily about them. And then they would also use a lot of reterritorialization. So what they would do is actually create parodies of famous songs. After the Paris attacks, just last Friday, they made a parody of a song by Daft Punk. And then they actually show their publicity actually shows a lot of time-space compression, because they reach so many different people worldwide, even though the distance is the same. Because of all the technology, because of things like news, because of popular media, they actually bring people closer to these people, as in these people could all see the Westboro Baptist Church's viewpoints, and they got a lot of attention. So let's talk a little bit about the responses that they got with this attention. So first of all, there were the legal responses. So there were many different laws that attempted to limit their funeral protests. For example, President George W. Bush signed into the law the Respect for America's Fallen Heroes Act, which prohibited protests within 300 feet of the entrance of any cemetery under control of the National Cemetery Administration from about 60 minutes before to 60 minutes after the funeral. There were many other laws passed that were following around these lines, including one passed in Illinois. Next, there was the international responses. So both Canada and the UK have actually decided to not allow access for specific members of the Westboro Baptist Church after a couple of them heard that they were going to come into their countries and protest various different funerals. And then actually one interesting response was a little bit of a cultural appropriation. In this case, there were many counter-protests, including one that attempted to make a mockery out of them by taking away their famous controversial sign, and excuse my language, God hates fags. They actually created, there were many counter-protests of people making fun of them using the slogan, God hates figs, and actually found verses within the Bible about how God exactly hates figs. So this is just a little bit of interesting cultural appropriation here. And finally, to try to put this entire project into a bit of a different light, I decided to make a comparison between them and other movements. The movement that I've chosen today was opposition against Proposition 8, which was a proposition that basically stated that only marriage between a man and a woman is valid or recognized within California. So this was a movement specifically against Proposition 8, Proposition 8 being an act against gay marriage. So, one of the comparisons that I would actually like to draw today would be how many of the people against Proposition 8 decided to protest in front of religious institutions. Specifically, they focused on the Roman Catholic Church and the Church of Jesus Christ and Latter Saints. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-Saints. Just like the Westboro Baptist Church did for these two institutions and various other Jewish and Islamic institutions. In fact, they even protested at the funeral of the former director of the Church of Jesus Christ of the Latter-Saints. But secondly, what a lot of these movements actually do is have this very loud minority type of idea in which they gain a lot of publicity and have a lot of hierarchical diffusion in that a lot of people that are most connected to mainstream media actually manage to hear their values and hear their beliefs and actually manage to adopt them. So one of the ways that the opposition against Proposition 8 managed to get so much public attention was by doing very controversial things. For example, there was a burning of the Book of Mormon, and a religious text from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-Saints. So many of these people that were opposed against Proposition 8 decided to burn the Book of Mormon as a symbol against these specific religions. However, at the same time, the Westboro Baptist Church did many things like that to get their viewpoints across, in which they blamed specific religious groups. For example, they burned the Book of Mormon publicly. But there are obviously a couple of fundamental differences that make the Westboro Baptist Church unique compared to all these different movements. First of all, the Westboro Baptist Church chooses to protest as a form to warn the world that it is doomed. It doesn't choose to protest because it wants to gain followers. It chooses to protest because they believe that they love people. The Westboro Baptist Church, in an interview with Russell Brand, has stated that they love people, which is why they protest, to warn people of their sins and to warn people of their tolerance for homosexuality, and to warn people that God will destroy the earth if they don't change their ways. And specifically also to warn people that it is probably too late to change their ways, to paraphrase it a bit. And secondly, it doesn't actually have that one specific group that it is actively opposing. It is actively opposing almost every group that isn't them. It is actively opposing other groups that identify as Christian. It actively opposes homosexuals. It actively opposes the policies of many different countries. It actively opposes quite a few things. However, there's also a lot more opposition towards the Westboro Baptist Church, while things like the opposition against Proposition 8 actually managed to garner a lot of support. The Westboro Baptist Church typically has a much, much smaller community of support. However, it does still manage to have a lot of funding and still does manage to be very sustainable. And the other interesting thing is that the Westboro Baptist Church chooses not to do things like use death threats or vandalism, which many of these movements unfortunately do. Unfortunately, many of civil rights movements, or even this most recent movement against Proposition 8, had actually used death threats and had actually used vandalism, but the Westboro Baptist Church does not believe in using aspects like this. And finally, it does believe in actively infringing on the rights of others. Their latest tweets talked about how the Paris attacks on Friday were brought about because of France's tolerance to homosexuals. It believes that the policies should not be in place to actually there should not be policies that actually tolerates homosexuals. So to put all this in conclusion, in a subjective viewpoint, the Westboro Baptist Church is a non-material culture, and it is a religious culture, but it's also culture bred by hate. But the common misconception is that it's completely just bred by hate. The common misconception is that it's just a hate group. But even though it might just be a hate group, it still is incredibly complex, and it still does use many interesting methods to get their messages across. It is definitely a sustainable culture, considering the fact that there's so much contagious and hierarchical diffusion, and it is also a culture that reaches out to quite a few people. So I hope this presentation was incredibly informative for you. Thank you.